North Africa, June 1942. The desert south of Tobruk is baking under a merciless midday sun. A long column of German supply lorries crawls along a dirt track, throwing up a thick brown wake of dust. The drivers have been at the wheel for 6 hours. They are tired, hot, and utterly certain they are safe. No Allied force has been spotted within 40 miles. Then, out of nowhere, they appear. 2 jeeps, just 2, moving at extraordinary speed across the open desert, closing from the flank like angry hornets. The Germans barely have time to register what they are seeing before the air is torn apart by a sound unlike anything they have encountered before. Not the familiar crack-crack of a rifle, nor the steady chatter of a Bren gun they have learned to recognize. This is something different, a ferocious, tearing roar. A wall of fire that seems to come from all directions at once, cyclic, overwhelming, unstoppable. Within seconds, 3 lorries are burning. The rest scatter. The jeeps vanish back into the desert as quickly as they came. German soldiers who survived these encounters would struggle to describe what had hit them. Some called it Die Höllenbren, the Bren from hell. The name was a tribute born of terror, attaching it to a weapon they already feared, the Bren, even though the 2 guns shared almost nothing in common except their nationality. What the Germans had encountered was the Vickers K, a weapon so ferociously fast, so lavishly destructive, and so brutally ugly that it looked as though someone had simply bolted 2 machine guns together and dared the enemy to survive. In a sense, that is almost exactly what happened. But to understand how this improbable weapon came to define the operations of Britain's most elite desert raiders, you first have to understand the problem it was designed to solve, and the desperate circumstances that brought it screaming into existence. By 1940, Britain found itself in an uncomfortable position that no amount of pre-war planning had truly prepared it for. The Royal Air Force had spent years developing fast modern aircraft, Hurricanes, Spitfires, and the bombers that would carry the war to Germany. But aviation moves quickly, and the guns fitted to many of those aircraft were falling behind the demands of the speeds involved. The Vickers K gun, formerly designated the Vickers Gas Operated or VGO, had been designed in the early 1930s specifically as an aircraft-mounted weapon. It was meant to defend bombers from attacking fighters, providing flexible, powerful fire from open or semi-open positions. It was a remarkable design for its era. By the time the war arrived in earnest, however, it had been superseded in the air by newer, faster-firing weapons built directly into the wings and fuselage of modern fighters. Thousands of Vickers K guns were suddenly without a purpose. They sat in stores. They filled warehouses. The RAF had no use for them. And for a brief, extraordinary period, the British military bureaucracy simply could not decide what to do with them. Meanwhile, out in the Western Desert, a new kind of warfare was being invented almost entirely from scratch. Small groups of men, operating far behind enemy lines, navigating by stars, surviving on minimal water, needed weapons that could deliver overwhelming firepower from the back of a fast-moving vehicle. A single Bren gun was accurate and reliable, but its magazine held only 30 rounds, and its cyclic rate, roughly 500 rounds per minute, was adequate rather than devastating. What these raiders needed was something that could turn a 2-second burst into carnage, something that would suppress, destroy, and terrorize simultaneously, so fast and so loud that no enemy force could organize a coherent response before the attackers were already gone. The Bren, for all its virtues, simply could not do that. The gap between what existed and what was needed had never felt wider. The solution, when it came, was not the product of a long research and development program. It did not emerge from a government committee or a formal military requirement. It came instead from the improvised genius of men who were tired of being outgunned and had noticed, with growing excitement, that those surplus Vickers K guns were sitting in RAF stores doing absolutely nothing. The Vickers K was not, by any measure, a beautiful weapon. It was large, angular, and heavy. A single gun weighed approximately 9 kilograms, or roughly 20 pounds, and with its distinctive drum magazine fitted, it had an almost comically top-heavy appearance. The drum itself held 96 rounds of .303 ammunition, more than 3 times the capacity of a Bren magazine, and the gun's cyclic rate was genuinely extraordinary for the era. At approximately 1,000 rounds per minute, a single Vickers K could fire its entire magazine in under 6 seconds. It was not designed for careful, aimed fire. It was designed to fill the air with bullets. Now imagine what happened when 2 of them were mounted side by side on a pintle in the rear of a Jeep.
The drum magazines, too, were a revelation. Loading a Bren under fire meant fumbling with a relatively compact box magazine. Loading a Vickers K meant snapping on a wide, flat drum that looked something like a large frying pan and contained enough ammunition to keep firing, long past the point where a Bren operator would be desperately reaching for a replacement. In the chaos of a high-speed desert raid, that extra ammunition was not merely convenient. It was the difference between mission success and disaster. The weapons were assembled and fitted largely by the units themselves, drawing on RAF surplus stocks and the considerable mechanical ingenuity that long-range desert operations tended to produce. No single factory turned out the twin-mounted Jeep configurations. They were the product of unit armorers working in field conditions, adapting existing equipment to meet needs that no weapons designer had anticipated. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It tells us you want more stories like this one. The operations conducted using these weapons are now the stuff of military legend, though for many years they remained classified, and the full scope of what was achieved was not publicly known. Between 1941 and 1943, small SAS and LRDG teams equipped with twin Vickers K Jeeps penetrated hundreds of miles behind Axis lines in North Africa, attacking airfields, fuel dumps, supply convoys, and communication lines with a speed and ferocity that the enemy found genuinely bewildering. The raid on Sidi Hanish airfield in July 1942 has become perhaps the most celebrated example. 18 jeeps, moving in 2 columns, drove directly across the airfield and through the parked aircraft, their Vickers Ks firing continuously. In under 15 minutes, estimates suggest between 30 and 40 German and Italian aircraft were destroyed or badly damaged. The raiders suffered remarkably light casualties. The psychological effect on the garrison was described in subsequent German reports as profound. Not merely the material loss, but the apparently impossible nature of what had just happened to them. Accounts from German soldiers who survived such raids speak repeatedly of the overwhelming noise, the inability to identify a fixed position to return fire against, and the sense that the attackers were simply everywhere at once. The cyclic rate of the Vickers K was a significant part of this effect. A weapon that fires 1,000 rounds per minute does not produce discrete, countable shots. It produces what sounds to the human ear like a continuous mechanical scream. It is instinctively terrifying in a way that a slower weapon simply is not, even if the slower weapon is in some technical sense equally dangerous. It is worth pausing to consider how the Vickers K compared with what the Germans were deploying in similar roles. German light vehicles in the desert were often equipped with the MG-34, a weapon that was, in many respects, technically superior to almost anything the Allies possessed at the time. The MG-34 had a cyclic rate of roughly 800 to 900 rounds per minute and was widely considered one of the finest general-purpose machine guns of the war. German soldiers were justifiably proud of it. It was accurate, reliable, and versatile. And yet, in the specific context of high-speed desert raiding, it could not match the twin Vickers K installation. The MG-34 was typically fed from either a drum magazine holding 50 rounds or a belt, and while belt-fed operation was theoretically superior for sustained fire, it introduced complications in a fast-moving vehicle environment. Belts could jam, snag, and tangle, in ways that the self-contained Vickers K drum largely avoided. More critically, the Germans were not operating in the same way. The Afrika Korps was, by and large, fighting a conventional war with unconventional skill. The idea of sending tiny groups of jeeps hundreds of miles behind their own lines to attack airfields was not part of the German operational vocabulary in this theater. They had the better gun in isolation, the British had the better concept, and the Vickers K was the weapon that made the concept work. The Americans, who were developing their own long-range rating capabilities, observed British practice with considerable interest. American OSS operators and later Jedburgh teams working in Europe drew directly on SAS experience, and the influence of the Vickers K installation on subsequent Special Forces vehicle armament is traceable, even if the specific weapon was eventually superseded. The principle, lavish automatic firepower from a fast vehicle delivered in overwhelming bursts, became foundational. How much did the Vickers K actually matter? It is a question worth asking honestly, because the temptation in this sort of history is always to inflate the significance of a fascinating weapon beyond what the evidence actually supports. The material damage inflicted by Vickers K-equipped raiders in North Africa was real and documented. Aircraft destroyed on the ground cannot fly. Fuel and ammunition dumps set on fire represent genuine logistical losses. The disruption to access supply lines and communication, while difficult to quantify precisely, absorbed German and Italian security resources that would otherwise have been available for frontline operations. Rommel himself acknowledged, in communications later recovered, that the activities of British desert raiders represented a disproportionate nuisance relative to the small numbers of men involved. But the psychological dimension may have been equally significant. Warfare is not purely an engineering problem. It is also a contest of will, confidence, and perception. The Axis forces in North Africa never found an effective counter to the long-range raiding tactics, in part because the Vickers K gave those raiders a firepower advantage that made direct confrontation, even with numerically superior forces, genuinely dangerous for the attackers' opponents. German and Italian soldiers in isolated desert positions knew that a small group of British jeeps could appear without warning, deliver devastating fire, and disappear before any coherent response was possible. That knowledge had an effect on morale, on alertness, on the willingness to accept isolated postings that does not show up in any order of battle but was nonetheless real. Several Vickers K guns survive in museum collections. The Imperial War Museum in London holds examples, as does the Tank Museum at Bovington. Seeing one in person is instructive. It is simultaneously more compact and more brutal-looking than photographs suggest, a weapon that seems to radiate mechanical aggression, even standing still on a display mount. Return, for a moment, to that desert track south of Tobruk. The burning lorries, the dust settling in the still air, the German survivors picking themselves up and looking out across a featureless landscape at nothing at all. What had just happened to them was, in the most literal sense, the product of necessity, improvisation, and a warehouse full of weapons that nobody wanted. No committee had authorized the twin Vickers K installation. No formal requirement had specified that surplus aircraft guns should be bolted to jeeps and driven into the desert at 90 miles an hour. It had happened because men in the field had looked at what was available, understood what they needed, and made the connection that the people further up the chain of command had missed entirely. That is a pattern that runs through the history of British military innovation with remarkable consistency. The solution is often not the newest thing, the most expensive thing, or the thing that took the longest to develop. It is sometimes the thing that was sitting in a warehouse gathering dust, waiting for someone to realize that the wrong problem had been solved with it, and the right problem had never been addressed. The Vickers K gun did not win the war in North Africa. Nothing wins a war by itself. But it gave a small number of extraordinary men the means to punch so far above their weight that the disproportion becomes genuinely difficult to believe. Dozens of men, in a handful of jeeps, destroying more aircraft than some entire squadrons, tying down security forces that dwarfed them in size, appearing and disappearing like ghosts armed with thunder. The Germans called it Die Hullenbrenn, the Bren from hell. They meant it as a description of terror. They were right that it was terrifying. They were wrong about what it was. It was an aircraft gun that nobody wanted, attached to a vehicle it was never designed for, fired by soldiers who were never supposed to exist, in a war that nobody had planned for. And it worked. That, in the end, is what makes it worth remembering.